Mr Miller.
Mr Deputy Speaker, like so many on these benches, Channel 4 has marked the landscape of our lives. Loved or loathed, the landmarks are all there to see across the broadcasting landscape. For me as a youngster, it was the Super Bowl on Sunday nights through the NFL programme that sticks in my memory. More recently, as an engineer, I've enjoyed the prominence and accomplishments of the characters on The Big Bang Theory and others which have taken our attention as a nation. And who could forget the cultural contributions of the likes of Homer Simpson, and in particular his contribution to the English language of maybe I'm the first member in this House to mention this here, but for the benefit of the member for Ockhill and South Perthshire, that was a cultural reference. Mr Speaker, this motion that's been put forward by the party opposite opens by saying that this House supports the UK's much-loved cultural institutions, which are celebrated around the world, while creating jobs and growth across the country. I'm sure these words share unanimous support across these benches, and I'm proud of this government's support for and recognition of the immense value of our cultural institutions. It was, after all, this government that opened the £1.6 billion Cultural Recovery Fund during the pandemic, a fund that protected museums, galleries and other cultural treasures from a pandemic that presented an existential threat to much on the UK's cultural landscape. And it was by a Conservative government that saved it. Mr Speaker, let me be clear. I think that the sale of Channel 4, the right sale of Channel 4, will help it to thrive in the modern era. Other honourable members have made that point, so I won't dwell on it. I also believe that the change in ownership can give it access to funds, again a point that other honourable members have made. But my main point, and perhaps in answer to several of the honourable members who've raised this, is why a sale is relevant and necessary. It's an important point to be made because it actually speaks to the management of how we manage public assets, the buying, the holding and the exiting of those assets. And here I might point out that much has been mentioned, the word ideology has been used several times by the opposition, and maybe as a gross characterisation, honourable members will forgive me if I say that often the opposition is characterised as being ideologically driven, and this side of the House is characterised or criticised even for being overly pragmatic. And it's interesting to see our actions here and our words here viewed through an ideological lens, when in actual fact it's a pragmatic response that we're bringing. Because as a state, we actually have a poor track record, and I mean this across all parties and all governments. We're very good at spotting problems, designing a response and delivering a solution. But then we tend to just hold on. We think it's virtuous, but in fact, we risk the creation of self-perpetuating institutions that become an echo of the past. The real question is not whether this is ideological driven or whether it's a pragmatic response, but actually, which is the better driver for creativity? I'm mindful of bodies such as NatWest, which until 2 months ago in fact, the government was still the majority shareholder. Mr Deputy Speaker, what happens when we hold an institution, and it's been proved and shown time after time, is that an institutional calcification occurs. Inevitably, there's a diversion of funds, more and more resource going into the self-preservation of that body. The fact is, the right sale, well managed, breaks that up. I will.
Enormously grateful for his comments, but does he actually have any evidence this is happening to Channel 4 in terms of the calcification he's talked about? There obviously is inflation in the sector. Does he think Channel 4 is markedly less innovative than other players in the sector? And could he speak a bit more about why he thinks privatisation would make a positive difference, given that Channel 4 has managed to flourish in 40 years of state ownership, and there are other state organisations, such as the Bank of England, where we wouldn't consider privatising them because they've shown their value over many years?
The Honourable Member for his intervention. He preempts my next comments, and indeed I'll come on to the fact of why the success is not just a measure of financial success, or flourishing is not just measured in finance. Because for every supply chain that might be disrupted by a sale, a new opportunity for new entrants to the sector is created. We've already heard one such intervention from the Honourable Member for Lichfield, I think it was. Some of those production companies that started with Channel 4 in the early days were cutting edge, were start-up businesses. Now they themselves are becoming institutions and established in their own rights. We've seen the same pattern, in answer to the Honourable Member's question, in the Silicon Valley perhaps. And for those agrarians and those who enjoy gardening and pruning fruit trees, we might think the same too, that sometimes you prune a successful tree in order to encourage further flourishing and production. After all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, Channel 4 has achieved its objective. And this is the point. It was set up by a Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher to create competition in our now thriving independent production sector. Now, having fulfilled this purpose, we're supporting our public service broadcasters to continue to grow, export British content and compete globally. To sell is a responsible question to ask. By way of further example, I spoke recently to the Chief Executive, the former Chief Executive of S4C, S4C, as we say, over the border. About a year ago, it was clear then that they were being drawn away from the traditional broadcaster role into more of a media company role. But the funding arrangements in place didn't facilitate that and were hindering that. And I see a parallel here to this situation facing Channel 4. To be clear, and in response to the Honourable Member for Cardiff West, who made the comment, success is not shameful, and a sale is not punishment. In conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the opposition should not fear change, nor should they resist the responsible management of public assets. It is the responsible thing, and it is the right time to ask the question now, what next for Channel 4?